Reading, recording in progress. Forums that matter. A community service to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. Greetings and welcome to Forums that Matter, a community service of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I'm Susan Alcorn, a member of the Forum Committee, and I'm the coordinator for today's discussion, which has been both remote and in person. Can everyone hear me? I want to check this out. Our topic today is immigration, net gain or net gain. Immigration has been an extremely important foundation of our country. Most people can trace at least part of their ancestry to an immigrant either recently or centuries ago. It's currently a hotly contested social, economic, and political issue. That's why we chose immigration as our forum topic this morning. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Ann Hill has been president of AMOS, Americans Making Immigrants Safe, for over 7 years. She's also on the steering committee of Northeast Ohio Friends of Immigrants. Ann has also held director positions at Metro Health in Governor Ted Smith's term and the Ohio State Council of the SEIU, Service Employees International Union. Brian Hoffman is the founder and president of the Ohio Center for Strategic Immigration and Outreach, shortened to OCSILIO. This organization is the first litigation-founded legal service for immigrants in Ohio. Brian has also worked on individual and family detentions related to immigration in Texas and Georgia. He has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, and a variety of other national media outlets, as well as local and state news publications. Before we begin our discussion, please turn off your phone or put it in airplane mode. Our speakers will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers from 9:30 to 10. I will now turn the program over to Brian Hoffman.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us, and thanks for the introduction. Do I sound all right? All right. Well, like Susan said, we're going to do about 30 minutes of talking about our various organizations and then open it up for questions. But I could talk about this all day. I have been doing nothing but immigration law for about 15 years now. And little did I know, as a young man growing up on a farm here in Ohio and learning Spanish in elementary school, that it would become the kind of a cornerstone of my career all these years later. So I want to give you an idea of kind of where we're at today in terms of the immigration, I would say debate, except debacle is probably a better description. So we have an asylum and refugee system that exists within the US and on an international level. And the reason for that is there are very clear historical reasons why we have an international refugee system. And in a word, it's because of the Holocaust. So Anne Frank and her family actually applied for visas to come to the United States, and those visas were denied. So she could literally be a 90-something-year-old woman in Brooklyn getting ready for Shabbat, and instead she's dead. If you read interviews from the people on the ship, there was a Faye Dunaway movie that was made about this whole situation. People thought that they had won the lottery. They were on the last ship out of Nazi Europe across the Atlantic. When they got to Cuba, the Cuban government had canceled their visas while they were en route. So they tried to land in Canada and the US. They were denied entry to all three countries, and they had to sail all the way back across the Atlantic to Nazi Europe, where a third of them died during the Holocaust. So the international community said, we have to do something about this. We can't go through this whole situation all over again. And we came up in the 1950s with the Refugee Convention. So it's very clear, it says no member of this convention can expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to a country where that person's life or freedom is threatened. That sounds fantastic, right? But the devil, as they say, is in the details. How do you implement this lofty international treaty at the individual level? In the US, our Constitution says that international treaties have the same force as federal law. So the 14th Amendment is very clear. If you enter into an international treaty, that's the law, and it is as powerful as regular federal laws in the US. There's a handful of, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Inter-American Declaration on the Rights of Man, all of these lofty agreements that we've made saying you have the right to apply for asylum, we have to give you a meaningful chance to apply for protection, and if you show that you deserve it, you can't be sent back to your home country. So this is the US law. I don't like the word alien, but that's the way the statute was written. So it says anyone who's physically present in the United States or arrives in the US may apply for asylum. And that's one of the major misconceptions about the process. If you're in Nicaragua right now, there's no way for you to apply for asylum. You have to come to the US border or already be in the US to file an application. And that's where there's this rhetoric around people should get in line. Well, the line actually does start at the border if you're applying for asylum. You can't mail a form from Managua. There is no other process. So when I think about what would have been my great-great-grandfather, Jeremiah Kiley, leaving County Mayo in Ireland in what would have been the 1870s, he was probably a scared little boy, but he did not have to apply for a visa. He could get on a ship in Ireland, sail across the Atlantic, and be admitted to the United States and essentially be a legal permanent resident from the very beginning without having to go through any of the paperwork that all of the folks who are here now have to go through. So for this group, it may also be particularly relevant that there are a lot of sources of divine law about how we are supposed to treat each other. Exodus, Leviticus, the Gospel of Matthew, I could go on and on. Every faith tradition has some version of the Golden Rule and also has some version of the you were strangers once in the land of Egypt rhetoric about how we are supposed to treat one another. So here comes the devil that's in the detail. In the US, if you remember back to maybe high school civics, the Constitution sets up the three branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. All of the immigration litigation and trials and all of that take place within the executive branch. So we are not in the federal judiciary when we're litigating these cases. We are in an administrative tribunal that is within the Justice Department. So under the executive, you can see the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. Those are the two agencies that we deal mostly with. And ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is part of Homeland Security, whereas all of the immigration courts are part of the Justice Department. So when you go in front of an immigration judge, this is not someone who was nominated by the President of the United States with the advice and consent of the Senate. This is someone who went on usajobs.gov and submitted their resume and was hired by the Attorney General. So there's a lot of training that we do with immigration lawyers where we talk about, like, yes, this is somebody who wears a robe and sits on a bench, but these individuals are very much more public policy agents of the executive branch than they are adjudicators weighing independent standards of law. And that's why a lot of folks think of immigration court as a place where politics masquerades as law. You think that you're trying to meet a legal standard, but really you're just trying to convince the guy in the black dress to check the right box on the right form. So you don't have the same rights in immigration court as you do in what we would call real court. You have the right to an interpreter. You can sometimes get time to consult with a lawyer, but there's no immigration public defenders. There's no such thing. And that's why my organization and organizations like me are so important to help people find lawyers. Because you have this theoretical, legal, abstract right to a lawyer, but that's absolutely meaningless if there are no lawyers out there who will take your case. And that's what we see happening again and again. I probably have 6 people texting me right now who want appointments in the next 2 days, and it's going to take me a couple of weeks to actually get to them. So to emphasize the problem, last time that the current occupant of the White House was in office, his attorney general essentially went rogue beyond what we had seen in past administrations and took the judges who denied the most asylum cases and began promoting them to the immigration appellate courts. So the Board of Immigration Appeals is now full of appellate judges who have been handpicked over multiple administrations because of their political positions, not because they're especially fair adjudicators or especially brilliant legal minds. So there's a handful of articles from a few years ago. You can see where this happened. And here's me on the 5 o'clock news last week here in Cleveland, talking about how one of our immigration judges here in Cleveland, who I actually work with at Catholic Charities, was recently fired as a result of these government cost-cutting measures. So on the one hand, the government's saying, we have to speed up the immigration litigation process. We want to deport more people. But there's also some judges that we don't like, so we're going to fire them, even though it slows down the entire system. I would call that talking out of both sides of your face, right? There's no way you can actually square this in a real public policy rationale. So the Attorney General of the US has a lot of power in the immigration world. He can essentially bypass the Board of Immigration Appeals and author decisions himself and designate them legal precedent. So we saw this happen in 2018, where Attorney General Bill Barr said, just because I think so by myself, on my own, domestic violence is not a good enough reason for asylum. Signed Bill Barr. And so for years, we had been applying for asylum based on domestic abuse. All of a sudden, you couldn't win those cases, and you had to appeal them again and again just to get a fair hearing. So that part of Bill Barr's devastating legacy was undone by Merrick Garland. But unfortunately, a lot of the things that Barr did when he was AG last time are still in effect. So one of the worst examples of playing politics with the immigration court was a case back in 2018 where a young man from Guatemala came as a teenager, was ordered to appear in court. He didn't show up for his hearing, but the judge at the hearing said, I'm not convinced that this kid got this letter. It looks like this is an incomplete address. I don't think he knew he was supposed to be here. So I'm just going to close the case rather than order this kid deported because I don't think it's fair. Well, the government appealed. The case went right to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General said, you don't have the power to do that. Judges can't do that anymore. You have to order them deported in this situation. You don't have the docketing control authority to administratively close cases. Not only did he do that, but then when they sent the case back, they said, make sure this is heard by a different judge. Don't give it back to Judge Morley. And you can actually see the Freedom of Information Act email within the immigration court talking about, yeah, reassign cases of this type to this judge so that he doesn't decide them the wrong way. That is not the standard of fairness that Americans expect when we go to court. And yet that's exactly what's happening. There are a lot of examples of how asylum doesn't work the way you think it should. And one of the perfect ones is the case from, this was, I think, back in the 90s. A woman in the El Salvador Civil War was kidnapped and kept in the jungle by the Marxist rebels and forced to essentially cook and clean and work as a domestic servant. She eventually escaped to the US and was granted asylum, but again, the government appealed. And on appeal, the court said, well, the cooking and cleaning that you provided to rebels in the jungle during the Civil War, that was material support to terrorism. So you supported terrorism and you were not eligible for asylum. And her asylum was taken away on appeal. So just because we have this great international agreement saying we can't send people back to countries where they might die, doesn't mean that we aren't actually doing that all the time, using all of these absurd legal loopholes. Again and again, when I work with law students and other lawyers, we talk about how these immigration court decisions come down to judges saying, yeah, this really obvious word doesn't mean what you actually think it means. It means what we need it to be so that we can deny relief to your client. Anne and I have been working on a case for a young man from the Congo named Jonas for 7 years now. And in Jonas's case, one of the issues on appeal was the court said, well, the word hearing doesn't actually mean like the 2 hours where you're in court having a hearing in front of the judge. It means the hearing and after the hearing when the judge makes a decision and the whole period of time when the case is on appeal and when the case is being decided by the appellate court. That's what hearing means. And so you didn't file this evidence during the hearing. You filed it while you were in court. And that's, we're interpreting hearing to mean something different. So that's the kind of stuff that we're up against all the time. Immigration lawyers are constantly lamenting how we have to write legal arguments about why there is no such thing as a non-torturous rape. Every rape is by definition torture. And yet you will find judges who say, well, in this case, I don't think it was. And you have to write these ridiculous arguments saying, you know, no, you stupid cretin. I do not agree with that analysis. And then you have to tone it way back down so you don't get disbarred. But here's an example of the public policy rationale that's behind this. These are 5 young men from the Carolinas who were apprehended. Most of them were on their way to high school. This was back in 2018, 2019. One kid had his backpack at the bus stop on his way to school, and he's arrested by ICE. I think only 3 of them ended up getting deported. A couple other folks got lawyers, and we managed to get them back out. But so those are 5 kids who made it to the US and got arrested in the Carolinas. here are 5 kids who never made it out of El Salvador, and they are escaped murderers and drug dealers who are on the run, who have warrants out for them. And here are 5 kids who died after we sent them back to their countries. So the question from a public policy standpoint is, do we want those 5 kids to be these 5 kids or these 5 kids, right? The way that we enforce our immigration law is affecting the outcomes of these people's entire lives. And I think we need to give it a little bit more serious deliberation. There are professional attorneys who have careers as federal litigators who are going to court and arguing that children don't need soap and toothbrushes. I would think someone like that should be just barred for making that argument. It does not have the smell test. And yet, this is a woman who I actually knew, whose child was vomiting blood in the detention center, and ICE would not release her because she was because a 6-year-old vomiting blood is a flight risk. And then, of course, we later found out that thousands of migrant children were sexually assaulted in detention centers. One of them, called Tornillo, was not even doing background checks on the staff that they were using to detain, to incarcerate immigrant children. And lo and behold, they had all kinds of problems as a result. So unfortunately, we are not alone in making it more difficult for people to get asylum. Back in the 50s, all of the countries that came up with these lofty goals of not deporting people back to their death, many of them have now gone through this process of interpreting the laws and regulations in a way so you can say that you protect refugees, but when it comes to a matter of practice, you don't actually have to let people stay in your country. One of the things we've seen, again, from the last administration is that a lot of government reports, like State Department's reports about human rights, are cutting certain references. So reproductive health, for example, if you had a State Department report in the past that you could rely on saying X country does not protect reproductive health rights for women, a lot of times you produce that same report and it's just gone. And so the government attorneys can say, well, this must not be a problem anymore because the State Department's not listing in its report. And we have to argue, no, unfortunately, the State Department is not a reliable source of information, and here's an expert to say why, which of course is all very expensive and time-consuming. So asylum has not been completely overhauled yet because a lot of the things you apply for are by statute. They're created by Congress. So there are still certain visas if you're a crime victim, if you're a human trafficking victim, if you assist law enforcement in an investigation. You can still apply for asylum, even though it's much more difficult to get. We haven't seen, maybe because the president and the vice president are both married to immigrant women, but we have not really seen any changes to the marriage-based immigration process yet, despite the crackdown on asylum seekers. So you can still, through marriage or through a family member, apply to get a green card. There are still processes where if you have an old criminal conviction, you can try to get it vacated. If you're an abandoned kid, there are still special visas for you. But there are all kinds of things that the administration did on day one that made things exponentially more difficult. So I could spend probably another hour going through all of the day one executive actions. I'll just highlight a few before I turn it over to Anne. It's just so surprising that the president has this much power. Arguably, he doesn't, right? But because the country's only been around for 250 years, we're still figuring out where the limits of this executive authority lie. One of the saddest things I just saw the other day, believe it or not, on social media was, I was born in 1983, and they're posting about, I might be the last generation to know what it was like to live without social media. I didn't have a smartphone until I was in law school. And so I think, the younger generation now has no idea what life was like before we all had those devices. So anyway, that gets all of this out a lot quicker when you can tweet to someone's phone that the law has changed. Right away, Trump basically rescinded any Biden area guidance that was helpful or positive. Biden and Obama had both moved away towards using private prisons, and Trump has gone right back to that. All of these various projects for allowing people to come to the U.S. from their home countries directly have been suspended. So, and again, they're talking out of both sides of their faces, because you're saying, we want to get all these people out of the U.S. and we want to enforce the law. Then you're saying, but all these legal ways that you could have got here don't exist anymore. So what do you really expect people to do? I think the answer is stay home and die. So there's already been litigation over birthright citizenship. You may have seen some of that in the news. That's been joined. There's a executive order about registering undocumented aliens, which there's a lot of unaccompanied minors who come to the border without any adult. And one of these heart-wrenching things that you see a lot of times is people writing in Sharpie their case numbers or their phone numbers for their loved ones. And of course, what does writing numbers on people's arms remind you of, right? The whole reason we have this system to begin with. So they are proposing a new system to register undocumented folks, cutting back on temporary protected status and contracting with all kinds of local law enforcement agencies to let them enforce federal immigration law, which I was always wondering why, when you have beat cops, patrolling the streets of a certain neighborhood and they have stop and frisk policies, certain things like that, wouldn't you like those same cops to be walking up into those high-rise Manhattan office buildings and looking behind the shoulders of those day traders who are all committing fraud? Why can't you stop and frisk somebody on the street? But financial crimes are happening rampantly in these downtown Manhattan high-rises. You can't stop and frisk the day traders. So basically, if you come to the U.S. border now, you're back in this Remain in Mexico program. You've got to wait until your turn. It's like the number at the butcher shop, only you're waiting for a chance to fight for your life. They're defaulting back to detaining everybody. Even though the numbers of border apprehensions were way down, the president declared a national emergency within his first month. And I could go on and on. One of the most interesting is that foreign drug cartels are now designated terrorist organizations. So I had a client who was a police officer in Honduras and arrested dozens of MS-13 members. The judge denied him asylum because he said, well, you really fear your fellow officers. You fear corrupt cops who are not supportive of the fact that you aren't corrupt. And that's just cop-on-cop violence, and that doesn't really qualify for asylum. But since this executive order, I filed a motion to reopen his case. And I said, he's an ally in the global war on terror because he testified that he arrested dozens of MS-13 members. So we should consider him an ally in the war on terror and give him asylum. I don't know if that argument's going to work, but that's what I'm using. So I'll just leave it there since I'm looking at the clock. There are so many changes going on a day-to-day basis that literally you walk into court, and my colleague had this happen. The judge, in the middle of a hearing, got a message from his clerk that we need to take a 5-minute recess. Goes back to his office and comes out and says, there was just a federal court injunction issued that affects this case, so we need to recess for the day and come back in a few weeks to decide how, during the testimony, while the guy was on the stand testifying that the injunction came in. So I did not take a law school class that prepared me for litigation by attrition or what to do when the rule of law is collapsing around you. And that's why I'm so glad that there are all these amazing community organizations like the UU Church and like me that I can collaborate and rely on. So thank you for having me.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me to speak with you today. And I always learn something from Brian, so it's great to be here with him. I want to tell you about one of the families that we work with. A young couple from a West African country came here about 4 years ago, came to the border, and they fled their country because there were massacres going on in villages and small towns, and they lived in a village. And the young man was confronted with either join the gangs or be killed. And so he and his wife fled. They left behind 2 young children, 3 and 4 years old, thinking that once they got to the United States and got settled and got jobs and got a home, they could bring their children to be with them. They're still separated. The children are still in the country of origin, and who knows if they will ever be reunited because of what's going on today. The young couple both applied for asylum. They, under the Biden administration, got their work permits. They both have full-time jobs, although low-income full-time jobs. They work in food packaging, which is a common place for new immigrants to work, especially since they have no education and no skills as we need them in the United States. But I remember taking the wife. The husband was detained or jailed when he went to the border and sent to a jail in Denver. And the wife was pregnant, so they didn't jail her. And she met up with an attorney who happened to be from Cleveland. And to make a long story short, she ended up in Cleveland. And I remember taking her to the airport to meet her husband when he got out of jail through this attorney, this wonderful attorney. And how wonderful it was to see them reunited. And ever since then, AMI has been supporting them in one way or another. We put them in temporary shelter. We then eventually were able to get them an apartment. We paid their rent, their utilities. We got them two English tutors because they had no English whatsoever. And on. We've helped them through so many things, and they are now paying their way. They're self-sufficient. But as you can imagine, navigating the systems in the United States they're difficult for us, native born, but the healthcare system, preschool they have now a 3.5-year-old and another one on the way. All those systems dealing with a community police department and court when they were hit from behind in a car accident. All those kind of things are so difficult for newcomers to the United States. And AMI, steps in and helps them. AMI is a 501c3 organization. We cut our first check in August of 2019. And really our purpose began as to raise money and disperse it to newcomers who needed help because they didn't have their work permits. Under the asylum laws, once you apply for asylum, you have to wait 180 days before you can even apply for a work permit and legally work in the United States. So that 6 months gap or more makes it very difficult for people to sustain themselves. And that's where AMI comes in. We help with rent. We pay over 50% of our budget goes for rent because we think it's really important to help families stabilize their situation, get into apartments, and feel some security in that situation, situation. So we raise a lot of funds to help people pay their way until they can get their work permits and be self-sufficient. So the young couple I mentioned, they are a success story, right? They are self-sufficient, except they get 2 young children who are still in their country of origin. AMI is able to be successful because of our volunteers. The volunteers are the backbone. We have one 20-hour-a-week staff person who helps organize and assign volunteers activities and support work. And we have another young man who helps with outreach and fundraising 10 hours a week. That's all the staff we have. We're really run by a volunteer board, and our volunteers are the backbone of the organization. And we have one volunteer here, Linda, who has been a volunteer for a long time, has worked with a family from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and has really helped that family get through all of the processes and systems and so forth. And that's another success story, where a single mom now has a full-time job and is able to support herself and her young son with the help of Linda all the way along the way. So our volunteers, as I said, help people navigate the systems. We help people set up their apartments with donated furniture and kitchenware, all that sort of thing. We help our volunteers help parents enroll their kids in school, get kids to doctors for their vaccination, a lot of health needs, because we have different standards here than a lot of the countries that people are coming from. Tutoring in English, on and on, all you can imagine all the needs that a family has, and our volunteers help people deal with those needs. At the board's December strategic planning meeting, we decided to add to our responsibilities, keeping people safe for obvious reasons. And to that end, we've done a number of things. We've conducted, with the help of Catholic Charities Legal Department, Know Your Rights workshops, so that our families know what their legal rights are if ICE stops them when they're driving, if ICE comes to their door, if ICE comes to their workplace. They know what their legal rights are. And they have some of the same legal rights that we do, or at least they have. We'll see. Right. So we've conducted Know Your Rights workshops for our families. And then we've also been distributing to businesses in Cleveland Heights, Shaker, Beechwood, the near West Side, Know Your Rights for businesses, because businesses have legal rights as well. And if ICE comes to your business, as they did to Cilantro Taqueria on Coventry Road, the business has the right to refuse the ICE agents to come into their kitchen or any private space that they have in their retail establishment. Unfortunately, Cilantro Taqueria didn't know this. There had not been Know Your Rights workshops for those employees, and they tried to flee because they panicked, and that's when they were arrested. So we're doing that. And then we're also raising funds for legal support. And as Brian alluded to, in Cleveland and probably everywhere in the United States, we do not have enough immigration attorneys to represent the people that need full representation. It's a real crisis. And we're working with a group, a coalition right now, to try to figure out how to expand that capacity. What kind of things can non-immigration lawyers do to free up our immigration lawyers for the most difficult cases and going to court and all that. And that's not an easy thing to figure out either. We're really struggling with it. But we are working in coalition with a lot of the other organizations in town, the refugee organizations that are having their funds cut from the State Department, but to try to expand our ability to represent people. And I see Susan getting nervous about the clock, which I'm very familiar with because I chair a lot of meetings. So I will stop and we can have more discussion.
Okay, it's now time. I have to remember this, Susan. It's now time for. It went off. I don't see the button. I don't see the button.
It's now time for Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting. I have a question. I don't know if it's either of your area of expertise. I am totally puzzled by the fact that a lot of large manufacturers, like the food packaging, really need cheap labor. And what they have now with the immigrants is slave labor, essentially. And I'm wondering if the fact that the current administration has what they say they consider disappointing numbers of people they're kicking out, excuse me, is there something going on behind the scenes where large manufacturers are telling them, hey, don't get rid of the immigrants, we need them? Because I just don't get it. The large companies tend to support the current administration, but yet they need these workers and we need them. So what gives?
That's a great question. And I think we are starting to see a little bit of that going on now, where the administration is starting to hear from these big companies like, hey, this is really hurting our bottom line. If anything would be persuasive to this administration, you would think these, money arguments about business productivity would. But even the business immigration system has been so badly broken for decades that you wonder, why doesn't the business community have more clout to get this fixed? When I do these public forums, we talk about how, Ronald Reagan was really the last president who was really good for immigrants. And of course, there are certain segments of the population that really like to feel good about Ronald Reagan. So you can talk about how, yeah, he was great for immigrants. But yeah, I think we need more of that. If you even farmers, I live on a farm down in Worcester. If you ask any farmer in Ohio, should it be easier or harder for you to find workers? They're all going to say easier, and yet many of them voted for the administration that's making it hard.
I just want to mention that the virtual audience can tap on the Q&A box on their website, on their virtual part. Okay.
So the title of the talk is Immigration Net Gain or Drain. So can you talk a little bit about the economics?
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest source of misconception, because people think immigrants don't pay taxes, immigrants are accessing public services that they're not entitled to, and surprisingly enough, none of those things are true. Most people who are in the U.S. without status are still paying payroll taxes because they're working with either a completely made up social security number or one that they got from someone else. Some people can get actual tax ID numbers and work with those numbers. So you are having taxes withheld from your paycheck, and you will never actually get any of that social security back. So in a way, they're propping up the system for the rest of us. And that's something that's not talked about. But you also cannot access public services without a valid US Social Security number. Sometimes even if you are a legal permanent resident, if you have a green card, you're not eligible for public benefits for something like 5 or 10 years. So I went to an event in Medina, and this guy swore up and down that immigrants are getting free health insurance and laptops and phones when they get to the border. And I had to explain, go anywhere and try to get health insurance, and don't put in your social security and see if that works. You can't get past that step. So there's a bunch of economic myth busting slides that a group has put out specific to Ohio that talks about, especially among our medical staff, how much of our medical professional personnel are foreign born. So there's so many examples of how we just we can't get by without immigrant labor in some form. And it actually is a net gain, much more so than people think.
Once you get a work permit, and they're not easy to get, it takes years sometimes, you will get a social security number, and the card says work only, it's for work only. But then, we have several people that we're working with to help them file their taxes for the first time because they have work permits.
Follow-up question. What is the rationale behind, if you're not legal, I don't care for that.
Undocumented.
If you're undocumented, you can't work.
What's the rationale for that?
So the government thinks that people plan their lives out based on the laws, and that's not really how incentives to do things work, right? But the government knows that your asylum case could take years and years. So they don't want there to be an incentive for someone who knows I don't have a winning asylum case to come and apply for asylum anyway, just to be able to work until they lose. So they want to make it more difficult. They want to make sure that you really are fleeing for your life if you're applying for asylum, not just using it as a backdoor to get a work visa. But in practice, it doesn't work that way. Children don't migrate, they flee. These are people who are coming from burning villages. They're not bothering to check the United States code to see what the best way for them to flee their burning villages are. So yeah, the government just doesn't want people showing up at the border who don't have asylum claims, even though we already make asylum so narrow and difficult to get that people whose lives are actually in danger aren't getting asylum when they should. But yeah.
And people do come to the border and do try to come fleeing poverty. But that under our asylum laws is not a justification for asylum. But they don't know that. They come and they don't know what our laws are. They just are fleeing, persecution, violence, war, poverty. they're looking for a better life.
There are like temporary work visas, but the whole seasonal worker program is done by lottery. So literally there are like hundreds of thousands of applications that go in and only like 60,000 of them get picked. So if you're a mom and pop dairy farmer and you're filing a visa application because you need someone to help milk your cows, you're competing with like Hewlett Packard that just filed 6,000 visa applications for their temporary software engineers. So it's literally a lottery. There's no real way to plan for a workforce that way.
I think one of the, first of all, thank you, Anne and
Right.
Brian. Thank you very much, and it's nice to see Anne again. So I think sometimes people don't realize that the immigrant that they see at the border, that their lives, it's like the iceberg that exists below the surface of the water. There's this whole part of them that Americans don't really know anything about. For better or worse, I spent some time in Honduras and Nicaragua. And take Honduras, largely under the grip of gangs that work for foreign companies, including, of course, the United States. One of the roles they play is the dispossession of campesinos, small farmers, from their land. Without their land, what are they going to do? You go to the capital city, there are no jobs. So what happens? Well, the father usually goes ahead, rides La Bestia to the United States and tries to get in and get some work. In one of the cases that I knew about in Honduras, the woman hadn't heard from her husband in 2 years. So what's she going to do? Well, she ends up doing the same thing because gang members look at her daughters in a not so nice way, and she figures it's time to leave. So I think, and I'm sorry for going on so long, but all these immigrants have stories, and we don't know a damn thing about it.
Salam and happy Ramadan. I can't help thinking of Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia University. It's a clear violation of the First Amendment since it seems based on his speech and association. But besides the political choice to deport him, I also object to his detention, and that too in Louisiana. So I guess my question is, he is actually a legal resident of the United States. How much protection does a legal resident have close to a citizen? I know they can't vote, but I'd like to hear more about that. And I insist that the rule of law, whatever he said or whatever he did, the rule of law should be upheld. Thank you.
Ramadan Mubarak. Thank you. Yeah, this is bullshit what they're doing to this man. It is unbelievable. Legal permanent residents of the United States are allowed to live in the United States permanently unless they violate the conditions of their residency. And the US is essentially just making up whole new things that you can do to violate the conditions of your residency. They do have some of these clever far-right lawyers who can look back to the 1800s and find some obscure statute and try to come up with an argument. But so they're essentially saying that because this individual was organizing protests that the government disapproved of, he is an enemy of the state. Which, to me, I mean, the First Amendment isn't completely dead yet, but that's a sign that we're going in the wrong direction with regards to free speech. We also saw this happen recently with some Venezuelans, where the government tried to use the Enemy Combatant Act or something from the Civil War to argue that they were deportable. So if you plan to live in the US permanently, we always advise people to get US citizenship because it's much more difficult to lose than permanent residency. Permanent residency, if you rack up a couple misdemeanors, they can try to take your permanent residency away. If you have a conviction for something that could be considered fraud or dishonest, they can try to take your permanent residency away. So it's really sad when you see these situations, someone who's lived in the US for 35 years as a permanent resident, and all of a sudden gets in a car accident or something and is facing deportation. So permanent residency, I think, seems like more of a protection than it really is. Folks who have permanent residency feel like they are very secure in the US, but you should try to get US citizenship. Not, it's not a Valentine, it's a chess game, right? You don't have to love America or the concept of citizenship to want US citizenship, but it's much more safe for you than as a permanent resident.
Yeah, to me. Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for your presentation this morning. I'm wondering, like okay. Okay. So you kind of referred to this when you talked about the slides that are available for economic myth and a conversation that you had. What I'm wondering is how we can educate ourselves to be able to speak to some of the rhetoric, to change some of the misunderstandings. I know people who are Trump supporters, and they're very passionate about their beliefs, but they're based on misinformation. And I just gotta believe that if they knew the truth, they would feel differently. So how can we do that?
One way to do that is to attend by Zoom our monthly meetings that we have through the Northeast Ohio Friends of Immigrants. And if you give me your email, I'll put you on that list. We do monthly Zoom meetings, first Tuesday of every month, 7 o'clock, in which we always have a guest speaker. Brian has been a guest speaker a number of times. We're hoping to get a guest speaker from the Haitian community in Springfield for our April meeting. We had at this last meeting in March, we had a woman who works for the United States Committee on Refugees and Immigrants. It's one of the refugee resettlement organizations in town, and they've had to lay off 700 out of 1,200 staff nationwide because the State Department is cutting off their funds. So we try to get people either from the Cleveland area who are working in this area of immigration support, either lawyers or others, experts, or someone from outside Cleveland as our guest speaker. And that's really to help educate the community, exactly what you're talking about. So that's one way. But there's also a lot of material on the web about the economic gain, the economy of immigrants and how they contribute to local and national economies.
How do we know that it's accurate? Because I would say these people are educating themselves as well.
Yeah,
Sources are really important. Yeah.
there's a group called the American Immigration Council, and they have a blog where a lot of folks, I've written blog posts for them before, where a lot of that is like the Mythbusters, getting to the facts kind of stuff. But yeah, it's about finding the right sources for ourselves. I grew up when you used to be able to believe the things that you read online, and now 95% of it is probably generated by a computer in Kazakhstan, right? I read a lot of foreign news sources, but I read The Guardian, I read BBC. There's NHK is the Japanese equivalent of the BBC, and it's a very sort of matter-of-fact, reliable news source. So pick your news sources carefully, I think is the big takeaway.
Two questions. One, could you distinguish between asylum seekers and refugees? It's not clear to me. And the other thing, and I just heard about a group called Cleveland Heights for Immigrant Rights. Are you working with them? They have been working with businesses in Cleveland Heights about all of these issues. And I haven't heard of anything in Shaker, where I live. Should we be thinking about doing something similar for other communities like Shaker?
So I'll take the first part first. Refugees are people who apply to live in the United States or another country from outside that country. You cannot apply for refugee status from inside the country. You have to apply from outside the country. Most most people do it from a refugee camp. And it's a process that goes through the United Nations and our State Department. No one is vetted more than refugees. It's a long, long process of being vetted in order to get refugee status into a second or third country. Asylum seekers, as Brian said earlier, have to apply from inside the United States. They cannot apply from outside the United States. And asylum is based on a discrimination based on nationality, race, political affiliation, religion, or belonging to a certain group, like an LGBT community. So those are the basic differences. The group you're mentioning in Cleveland Heights, that's a relatively new group. And they started after Salon Taqueria was raided or, visited by ICE. And we did do some initial work with them in terms of the business distribution. We're not working with them anymore. In terms of a group in Shaker, I think it would be better to, join AMI or one of the other existing organizations, of which there are quite a few in Cleveland. There's Resource Cleveland on the west side. The resettlement organizations, 3 of them, which are still working, even though they have to lay off staff. Catholic Charities does a lot of very good work and they have the largest group of immigration lawyers in terms of a nonprofit. So I would say join one of the existing organizations rather than starting something new. And we have done business distribution in Shaker at some of the businesses in Shaker. That's an ongoing program that we have because there's so many businesses. We haven't finished them all, but yeah, that's what I was.
I spoke to a group of caseworkers from refugee resettlement agencies a couple of years ago, and we did a show of hands who had someone wait the longest in a refugee camp before they were finally resettled to the US. And it was 30 years. Wow. A guy spent 30 years, and it's not uncommon to spend decades in a camp before you're resettled, which is why some people think I have a better chance just going to the US border than trying to go to this UN-sponsored camp. The oldest refugee camp in the world is Kakuma in Kenya, which is bigger than the city of Akron. So that's how, you say refugee camp.
And there are no refugee camps in the Western Hemisphere, which is a very deliberate thing, by the way, but more questions.
We have time for one more question. One more question.
I think one of the misunderstandings that you were asking about is that the difference between refugees and asylum seekers, refugees do get funding, they do get money. And so people think everybody gets money. And so if you could just talk a little bit about why AMI is so different from refugees.
Yeah, that's right. I should have, thank you for that, because I should have said that. Refugees get 90 days of support for rent from the US government. They used to, everything's changing. As well as benefits, they're entitled to benefits. They get a work permit as soon as they become a refugee, so they have a head start on things. It's still very difficult. I don't want to minimize the difficulty of being a refugee in the United States, but they get those kind of public benefits that asylum seekers don't. And that's why AMI has focused mostly, not exclusively, but mostly on asylum seekers because they get no benefits unless they have a US born child, and then they can get SNAP or a little bit of cash assistance for that child only, not for anybody else in the family. But that's a major difference.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. And I want to mention that this forum is easy to share with others. It's been recorded and this forum has been recorded and will be available on our website a few days from now. And the other thing I want to mention is our 10:15 service upstairs. And you are welcome to attend it or watch it on our YouTube page. Today's sermon topic is small group ministry. We Unitarians like to build friendships and relationships with each other, on a variety of shared interests and activities. We currently have 25 small groups that socialize and build community by walking together, sharing meals and entertainment, gardening, focusing on diversity and LGBT issues, creating poetry, reading books together, and men's groups that cover a wide variety of common interests. If you'd like, and that's what the sermon will be about. If you'd like to receive our weekly reminders of forums we have every other week, please fill out the form with your name and email address on the clipboard at the back of the table, or you can see me. I have the form also. In 2 weeks, which will be April 6th, we have a forum on renewable energy. Ohio is one of the top 10 states for total energy consumption, but we rank 40th out of 50 states in renewable energy programs and progress. In this forum, we'll see what's happening locally and beyond. It's another one of our boring topics, right? To see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website at uucleveland.org. And I want to thank you again for joining us this morning. It's been a wonderful opportunity to listen and share our thoughts and attitudes and learn a lot about this whole thing called immigration. Thank you.